Hello, everyone. This is Colin once again, and you are watching Dreaming in Symbols, the podcast dedicated to discussing religion, psychology, uh, philosophy, mythology, history, politics, the whole nine yards from a unique perspective, looking at it from a point of view that's usually not discussed by very many platforms. Most platforms are dedicated to looking at the topic of religion from either a materialistic reductionist perspective, which comes in a variety of forms. Some might call it neo-atheism or just hardcore reductionism. On the other hand, its usual partner in debate is the literalistic dogmatic perspective, usually considered to be fundamentalist or narrow in its approach to applying religion and its interpretation thereof. Dreaming in Symbols is a podcast dedicated to looking at religion from a third perspective, one that is spiritual but not dogmatic, and typically looking at things mainly from a mystical, subjective, qualitative perspective. So that is what makes Dreaming in Symbols a unique podcast and platform. So today I don't have any guests in the traditional sense. I don't have. I was going to try and get Klingshore on here to do the third part of the Hadith discussion. He and I have been, talking about Hadiths for a couple episodes, and unfortunately, he's very busy right now, so he could not break away from whatever it is that he's up to. And so I hope to have him in a future episode to discuss the Hadiths. So I don't have any guests for today. So I have a list of things I'd like to discuss. So I'm going to try and talk about a number of topics for the next hour, and then I'll go to the news, as I've been doing for the past couple episodes, going to the news to discuss some interesting things, probably talk about Pope Francis within the last half hour, because I think it was yesterday, the day before, I went on my Twitter feed, and almost every single news platform that I follow the Huffington Post, the Huffington Post Religion, specifically New York Times Opinion, New York Times, etc. And I mean, it was just like article or post after post, tweet after tweet was about Pope Francis. So I think that's a no-brainer. We're going to have to talk about Pope Francis during this podcast within the last half hour. But in the meantime, what I'd like to start the show with is I've written down a number of things here to discuss. So one thing that I want to talk about is a topic that was brought up a few episodes back. I had Path of Abraham on the show, and he and I discussed the Book of Job, and it was a great discussion because I had never really considered the Jewish perspective on the Book of Job. And so I thought it was great to be educated in that regard. And so I thought about it, and in the podcast, in that particular episode, I had discussed Carl Jung's Answer to Job. And this is a book that I had wanted to do something on, either write a blog post about it or do a video or something. And it's so potent. I mean, Jung considered his book Answer to Job to be basically his most difficult book to write, and also his most profound book to write. I believe he was getting on in years when he wrote this book, and he was suffering from some physical ailments. I believe he had a heart attack or something, and it was just he felt emotionally, physically, and mentally, relieved after he completed this small book, The Answer to Job, and Jung considered it to be one of his most important texts. It remains his most controversial, and he received a number of letters from concerned individuals who were confused by the nature of the book. because it appears that Jung is psychoanalyzing not only Job, not only Satan, not only Jesus Christ, and the Apostle Paul who wrote Revelations, but God himself, Yahweh himself. But I think that, you know, there could be some argument for this if someone reads between the lines. In other words, if you do your own independent reading into the text, you might come up with this particular opinion. But really, if you read Jung for what Jung says in his own book at the very beginning of the text, you see what his main point is of writing the book. In the very beginning, he is saying that very much what the point of this podcast is, that he's not really concerned with the historical Jesus, and he doesn't want to take the position that just because there's the evidence for Jesus is maybe not as solid as maybe some people would like it to be. He's not willing to just drop kick the person of Jesus out the window. So in other words, he denies the reductionist perspective. And it makes sense because when Jung was still a colleague of Sigmund Freud's, Freud really represents the reductionist perspective. And perhaps in future podcasts or just videos on my channel, I will no doubt discuss Freud's perspective on religion. But for now, it makes sense why Jung was not comfortable with the reductionist perspective as being the main way of looking at these things. You know, and so on one hand, he doesn't go that direction. On the other hand, he's uncomfortable with the dogmatic religious approach. So he's not willing to make metaphysical claims about Jesus or about Christianity or religion in general. Okay, so he's not willing to say with absolute certainty that the metaphysical claims of religion are tenable or should be upheld. But he takes a unique third perspective. And the third perspective is, again, something that I feel is sort of the banner of or the foundation of this podcast, really, is looking at things from a psychological perspective. So he's not willing to say that something is for sure historically true or not. Similarly, he's not willing to say that something is metaphysically true or not. So he's rather agnostic about those things. But he is very much willing to say that the story of Jesus, or the biblical narrative as it's presented in the book of Job, or any scripture for that matter, is psychologically true. And so he is rather Gnostic, if you will. Of course, he was accused of being a Gnostic, and he didn't like being called that. I think he didn't like being called it because people usually used it to attack him and dismiss his work. They used Gnostic and mystic in a derogatory way, and I believe if he had been called that in a positive way, he probably wouldn't have reacted negatively to being called a Gnostic or a mystic. That's just my opinion, though. So he was rather Gnostic, if you will, you know, about the psychological truth behind religion. That there are psychological truths when looking at Scripture. That Scripture, we can say, is commenting on is commenting on what's happening within the individual and collective psyche of mankind, of humankind. So that is something, that's a perspective that's not usually discussed in mainstream discussions. It's something that has sort of been lost on most of society. And I think it's just because the loudest voice in the media right now, the voices of the media, the loudest people are usually your typical religious person. And what I mean by typical is somebody who is comfortable making metaphysical claims. And making metaphysical claims in the affirmative. So really, I do think that most of the battle, and I use the word battle because I do view most of the debates out there as being about battling each other and defending your position. I think most of the debates that rage out there are one that are usually trying to either knock down or prop up a historical religious claim or a metaphysical religious claim. And yet no one talks about, hardly anybody talks about the psychology. Hardly anybody. And I just think that it's such an unusual position to take. And so I know for a fact that when I've had discussions with, let's say, fundamentalists that are religious, and I've talked to people who are very much encapsulated in their materialistic reductionist perspective, not necessarily atheists, but one could make the argument that they typically are atheistic, maybe non-theistic. What I find is and this is something I've talked to Wayman 29 about, I found that when when I bring up the Jungian perspective or the psychological perspective, as Jung demonstrates in the answer to Job, I get blank stares, or the conversation is quickly over, because it's just an area that people don't take time to research or to study. So I think that that's something to keep in mind regarding Jung's perspective and answer to Job in particular. So what is the answer to Job? I guess that's something. So spoiler alert. I should say spoiler alert for those of you who have not read the book. Okay. I'm not going to analyze the entire book, but I'm going to talk about the answer to Job from my understanding of the text, how I understand it, my understanding of reading it. And I may have to do an additional video, a separate post regarding it. But what Jung essentially says in answer to Job, after he makes the statement that he's really looking at the psychological implications of the story, he's not arguing that the book of Job is historically accurate, nor is he saying that it's metaphysically true. He's looking at it, what does it mean psychologically? And what he says is that Yahweh needs man to become conscious. So in other words, man, in some ways, if I understand him, man is dependent on the idea of God, which Jung would say is the self. But the self can only be understood by consciousness by man. So in the book of Job, Yahweh is at this point very much still unconscious. Yahweh is not very relatable to man. So Job is basically the ego. In Jungian and Freudian terms, ego is consciousness. Job is consciousness, and Yahweh is the greatest archetype within the unconscious, which is the symbol of the self. I know I'm using a lot of terminology here, and I apologize if the listeners are not familiar with Jungian terminology. But the archetypes are these shared qualities, if you will, that are shared amongst all humans on an unconscious level. Okay, sometimes they're referred to as instincts, but this is something that that Jung theorized is something that our whole species shares psychologically. Now, Yahweh is essentially the symbol of the self. At this time, though, the self's relationship to the ego, meaning Job, is rather unconscious. So this is why Yahweh doesn't make any sense to Job. This is why Job is very confused by Yahweh, and why us as readers might be confused by the book of Job's manifest content. Because why is it that Satan is able to dupe God into making this bet to essentially take Job, who has done nothing to deserve the negative things that are about to happen to him. And yet God takes this bet with Satan and essentially strips Job of all of his good things in his life and reduces him to a place of suffering. You know, that is something that's very confusing, I think, for people who read the book of Job. And it's at this point that when Yahweh appears finally, and he's in the whirlwind, and he's saying, you know, he makes all these statements about how grand he is, about how he's in control of everything, and how, you know, and there's no recognition, there's really no reconciliation between Yahweh and Job by the end of the book, from Jung's perspective. And his interpretation, his psychological interpretation of the text, is because the symbol of the self, meaning Yahweh, there's still a disconnect between consciousness and unconsciousness. There's no relatability at this point. Man is still wholly man, and Yahweh is now representing itself as a force of nature to be reckoned with. And there's a huge disconnect between the two. God and man are not one. There's this gulf between them, psychologically speaking. So the answer to Job, according to Jung, is when God psychologically decides to become man. So we move now into the New Testament, and the New Testament represents a shift in the narrative, or a shift in the psychological narrative. And now God has become man in the form of Jesus Christ. So here we have the symbol of the God-man. The anthropos is now, and Jung says that psychologically speaking, the self has to become man for integration to occur. So Jung says that, you know, God was troubled by the fact that he had been duped by Satan, that this reconciliation had not occurred between himself and Job, and to rectify that, God has to become man so that God can understand man. And so you have this great symbol of the self, which is something that's more relatable, okay, than Yahweh. Again, I will be very clear. I'm not speaking in terms of history, nor am I speaking in terms of metaphysics or religious truth. Jung would say that this is all psychologically true, that these ideas are psychologically true. It doesn't really matter if we can prove scientifically or historically or metaphysically the virgin birth actually happened. That's irrelevant in this context. What's relevant is the motif or the psychological concept of the virgin birth. What does Jesus mean as a psychological symbol? And we see that what Jung calls the self is also called the God image. So the self archetype is the totality of the entire psyche of humankind that makes up consciousness and unconsciousness simultaneously. So Jesus is in some ways, is a more advanced image or symbol of the God archetype, the God image archetype, the self, because he is relatable. So unlike Yahweh, who is, you know, in the whirlwind, is this manifest, natural, chaotic thing. Jesus is representing the ultimate good. He's relatable as a human being to other human beings. But the thing that has not been settled yet is the question of evil. And Jung was very big about symbols having simultaneous opposites: positive, negative, light and dark, mother, father, etc., etc. And it's no mistake that Satan appears in the narrative with Jesus. So earlier in the Old Testament, the benefit of having a very unconscious Yahweh, if you will, Yahweh, symbolically speaking, very unconscious, is that it's this nebulous chaos that contains everything, which is why in the book of Isaiah, Yahweh is made to say, I am the author of both good and evil. So, and as Path of Abraham said to us on this program, on this podcast a few episodes ago, the Jews are strictly monotheistic in that when they don't ascribe a negative power to things when things go negative, or when bad things happen to good people, it's all within the realm of God's power. God is the author of these things. By the time we evolve to the Christian perspective, though, there's a splitting of the archetype, because you have Jesus as being the symbol of the ultimate good, but now that the God image has evolved into this very much this central image of Jesus, there has to be a counterbalance to Jesus, which is Satan, the person of Satan. And there has to be this reconciliation between the two of them. Wholeness must be completed again. But now we see that in the person of Jesus, God, he is the God-man, psychologically speaking. And so you have God being able to relate to man, man being able to relate to God. But what are we to do about this, the image of evil? Well, there's several places that Jung mentions, and I have found them myself, that I find very fascinating in the New Testament, where the language that describes Lucifer is also described for Jesus. So, to say that Lucifer is the morning star, Jesus, I believe in the book of Revelations, calls himself the morning star. So you have statements made for both figures equally. Also, the fascinating statement that when Jesus teaches the Our Father prayer, he says, lead us not into temptation, speaking to Yahweh. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil, right? So interesting that even at this stage, we're being told that God can tempt. So again, saying that the self, the God image archetype contains both good and evil is something that's not too far-fetched, just looking at the text of the Old and New Testament. Jung also looks at the book of Revelation as purely psychological. It's not a literal thing that's going to happen. It's not some John of Patmos did not see if there was such a man, and it's not meant to be a historical book. It is a vision that he had that had psychological symbolism. And so it's not something that we're supposed to crack open and read and take literally. If you do that, you end up like that fringe Mormon group I talked about a couple episodes back, the fringe Mormon group that said that the end times was supposed to happen a couple weeks ago. That the blood moon was one of the signs that, there'd be this great economic crash, and that, all, earthquakes would be felt in Utah. And I'm looking around going, well, I'm looking outside my window right now, and the sun came up, the breeze is blowing, and we're all still here for now. But this is the danger of taking scripture literally, is that you have this unfortunate event or hypothesis that occurs, and it just doesn't pan through. And then people are left to wonder, well, if Revelations isn't something that's supposed to literally happen, then what's the point of it? What's the point of religious scripture then, if we can't, on one hand, as the reductionists would say, dismantle it, drop kick it as some primitive, bygone text that has no relevance for today's society? But on the other hand, the people who right now are complaining that Pope Francis isn't Christian enough because he didn't mention Christ once, according to one headline, which I'll talk about in the last half hour of the show, because he didn't mention Christ once during his address to Congress. Right. The Pope's not Christian enough. I'm not even a Catholic, And I feel like that's a really weird statement to make. You know, the vicar of Christ is not Christian enough. Okay. But see, that in my opinion is the problem with taking that stance of literalism or pure rejection. Now, I'm not to say that there aren't things in the Bible or any scripture that are objectionable. I would agree with someone like Richard Dawkins that 21st century individuals read the text with a 21st century morality and mentality. And there are things that we might read on the manifest level and think, oh, that's horrifying. But as the phrase goes, why, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We should take a step back and consider, what do the traditions say? What are the nuances within tradition when it comes to interpretation? And are there such nuances? Is there a non-literal approach? Are there verses interpreted and have been interpreted in a way that, that diffuses them from being problematic? Or just outside of religious traditions, does psychology, have psychologists of religion looked at scripture and thought, there's a different way to look at this? There's a totally different way of looking at this stuff. And indeed, people find that that's the case. But I think that people get uncomfortable with this because it's so, as I said earlier, it's so foreign to how people usually approach scripture. It's a little bit sophisticated because it does mean you have to do a lot of research. You have to read Carl Jung's, I believe his collected writings alone is 20 volumes. Not that every single one of his books has to do with what we're talking about right now, but it's good to know. And you also have to read a lot of comparative religion and comparative mythology, and you have to be able to look for patterns and see that there are these things that occur throughout many different stories in mythology and in sacred scripture. And yes, to some extent, you have to, in some ways, buy into the psychological perspective. I mean, you have to essentially say, this makes sense to me. The psychological perspective speaks to me personally, and I agree with it. And not everyone, it won't speak to everyone, but I think it's something that needs to be, it needs to be given its fair day in court, if you will. And pausing here for a second because I just got a message on Facebook. Okay, it's not someone trying to get onto the program currently while we're live, but something else about a potential idea for a future show. Appreciate that. Again, this is Dreaming in Symbols podcast. It's 5 p.m. or 4:59 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, September 26th. I've just been talking about for the past half hour about Carl Jung's approach to religion, doing a very brief, rudimentary summary of his book, The Answer to Job, and the implications of taking the psychological perspective when studying religion. If anybody would like to call in and call into the program, please send me a message either on my Facebook, which is Aussie CDA. Also my Twitter account, which is Colin A at Aussie CDA. Or you can message me on YouTube. Somehow send me a message and I will send you the link to get on to the show. Got 3 tabs open, toggling to see if anybody would like to come on, but so far nothing, which is totally fine. But I'm just glad that we're all still here. I mean, I'm glad that the Mormon prophecy, the fringe Mormon prophecy of the end times, I'm glad that turned out to not be true. So another thing that I had mentioned, just to kind of switch gears here, still staying with Carl Jung though, but going to a different topic. Something else that I've been thinking about and really mulling over for the past few weeks now, give or take, and I was going to write a blog post, and I still might, but I just wanted to talk about it here. was this question. I had talked about this with Farhan Qureshi when I had him on the show. It was a few episodes back. It was just Farhan and I. I think we were talking about, it was either the one about apostasy in Islam, or it may have been a few episodes back. I'm not really sure which one, but Farhan's been on the show twice. And we were talking about, you know, different ways of looking at data or information. And I had said that I think that it's really a question of whether people use quantitative or qualitative data when discussing whatever topic, right? So we might say that most hard sciences like physics or, you know, chemistry, etc., probably safe to say they use quantitative data. They're looking at numbers. They're looking at raw data. They're using statistics and other very advanced, well, physics, calculus, and they are proofing things, and they are, I mean, this is, you can probably tell by 5 seconds into me talking about this, it's not something I know a lot about. I'm not a hard science or math dude by any stretch. But I know that it makes sense to use that type of data. And in fact, quantitative data is also used in my field, which is counseling and also psychology. And quantitative data is used primarily even in those fields. But there are other fields that take things from a qualitative perspective. Psychology and counseling do use qualitative data. They a lot of the social sciences also will use qualitative data. Case studies are used, et cetera, et cetera. And I started to think to myself, well, is it something within people's personality that really certain types of data gel with people? So we probably all know that guy who is a huge math freak, huge statistician. They came out of the womb with a calculator in their hand, right? And they want to see the physical data. They want to get the physical proof. They want to have it all cataloged and categorized, and they will not be convinced until you can prove it, that it's the greatest probability that it's true. They want to conduct that type of research, or they'll only accept that type of evidence for pretty much anything that we're talking about. And I think that there's that type of person. Then on the other side, there's that type of person who is really only interested in talking about subjective experiences. They want to get to know people. They want to interview people and say and see, what was that experience like for you, and get this narrative, get this picture over the course of time of an individual's experience. And they might go out and interview tribes or you know, and stuff like that. And so I think that speaks to a different type of individual, a different personality. So essentially, does one type of person, and we're talking in generalizations and extremes here, does one type of person really value looking out information outside of themselves, outside of the person, objectively speaking? Or is there another type of person that likes to look at things subjectively, looking within, thinking about how they're reacting to things, or how other people subjectively might be reacting to things? And so I thought about this, and I thought, you know, I wonder if Carl Jung ever really framed it that way when he was discussing extroverts and introverts. So I picked up a copy of his book, and I have had it for a while, The Basic Writings of Carl Jung. And there's a selection there from his book Psychological Types, which is about personality types. And I read it, and lo and behold, when he's discussing extroverts, he's describing them as really caring about outside data, looking at objects from the outside, getting data, this type of thing that you would expect a quantitative statistician or someone to really appreciate. They want to know what's happening outside of themselves, and they will focus on proofs that explain the outside objects or object. On the flip side, an introvert is more concerned about about the subjective experience, either their own or other people's. And they go about looking for proofs that answer those types of questions. So when I read that, I thought, well, this makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense why perhaps this is an answer to the one piece of the ongoing puzzle about why you might talk to somebody about a certain subject and they just look at you with a blank face. It's almost like you're speaking two different languages. And I think that keeping this in mind, I think is very helpful, because then we might be able to discover why there is this debate raging between people who are more inclined to value subjectivity, such as spiritual experiences or mysticism, the psychology behind why people might do things, the emotions, what did it mean for them to have a conversion experience, looking at case studies, looking at the biographies of saints or sages. That type of evidence might be very important for people like that. The other side of it might just think, well, no, I mean, reality can be best understood by looking at things from a quantitative perspective. I want to know, I want to do a bunch of tests, and I want to understand the material world the best by looking at things from that perspective. And in some ways, it's like certain types of proofs really only, or they're best served to talk about certain subjects. So I think that, quantitative proof is excellent for science. And this was something that was sort of brought up. I'm actually taking a research in counseling class right now in my master's program. And this was something the professor brought this up, doctorate in educational psychology, and just said that, yeah, there are types of proofs. I mean, science has to use quantitative data. It has to. It doesn't matter whether someone has a personal subjective opinion about biology or genes or DNA or things that are outside of the human condition, right? They're outside of ourselves, because there's no room for subjectivity in that. I mean, you're not always going to be able to get rid of subjectivity, but it doesn't really matter how I personally feel about Einstein's equations or Stephen Hawking's works in physics. It doesn't really matter. But if I say that I had a spiritual experience, or if someone says that they look back on the course of their life and they had these experiences that really speak to the human condition in the form of memoir or biography, that's very subjective. I can't really use quantitative data for that. So, like, I recently finished the book by Michael Muhammad Knight called Why I Am a Salafi, and I'm hoping to have Michael Muhammad Knight on the show. I think that would be awesome. But I would not take his data, if you will, his books, his dozen books that he's written, which are all, for the most part, are all autobiographical, with the exception of maybe a couple. He's got 2 novels and 1 study on the 5 percenters, the one sect that split it off from the Nation of Islam. With the exception of those 3 books, the rest of them are all very much autobiographical. That's all very subjective. He's telling us his experiences. That's all very much qualitative information. So I think both types of proofs serve a purpose, but they speak their own language. And I think this is why it's difficult when we are discussing, for example, elements of social science, elements of religion, elements of spirituality, and we're trying to either disprove those experiences by using quantitative data, or we're trying to actually prove those experiences by quantitative data. I think both are actually fundamentally false. And as my professor said in the class, science can't prove God. And really, he went on so far as to say, and you can't prove God via science. You can prove, quote unquote, God for the individual by talking to them about their subjective experiences. But unless God comes down, we all capture him on video camera, it's just not going to happen. And I say that as somebody personally who follows Carl Jung's perspective of valuing God, the concept of God psychologically. I'm not a skeptic by any stretch. I'm not a traditional theist. I sometimes joke and say I'm an agnostic Gnostic, meaning I am agnostic about the metaphysical details, but I'm rather Gnostic about my own experiences have informed me that there is something greater out there, something that's transcendent, beyond description, which I know will piss off a lot of people who are very much stuck in their ways by looking at quantitative data. They want to be able to say, well, if God's out there somewhere, I should be able to get data on him. But what they're really saying is they want to get data, they want to get quantitative data on him, right? This is why it would be, which is why some of the most interesting discussions occur on the fringe end of physics. You know, there's a physicist that is even a member of my congregation, a physicist who believes in God, but he believes in God in his own way as a physicist, because he's willing to say that there are these the final frontiers that physics still has not answered, but there is some connection, the argument would go, between spirituality and some of these outer edges of, let's say, physics, or even, as Jung would say, psychology. But I think because dogmatic individuals have tried to use science, they've tried to suggest that quantitative data somehow proves metaphysical ideas, that it's sort of left a bad taste in a bunch of people's mouths, right? They're sort of like, we don't, you know, if so, you know, some people I'm sure have said, if another religious person tells me that God predicted embryology, I'm gonna smack somebody. You know, and I don't blame people for that. I really don't. You know, look at the reaction that happened with Hamza Zortzis when he ditched the embryology thing, right? I mean, that caused so much debate and controversy amongst Muslims and non-Muslims, right? Because this had been a narrative that had been going on for so long, that you could prove God via quantitative proofs. So that's my rumination on that topic in particular. Another thing that I wanted to bring up, because this is so completely switching gears now at this point. This is something that's come up. I've had a number of people who have asked me if I know any good introductory, you know, any 101 book on Zen Buddhism or meditation. This has come up in my own personal, you know, past week. I've had a couple people who have said, hey, you know, do you know any good book to introduce me to Zen or meditation? So I thought I would share it because I've had some good experiences with this. A great book is by the author Suzuki, and it's called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. Excellent book. It's very short. It's it really boils Zen and meditation down to a very simple concept of just practice, just sitting and meditating. Something that anyone can do. And as I'm talking out loud, I'm looking, I have some bookcases that are near me. I know that this book, I think, lives in this part of my place. And so I'm looking to see if I can find it. If I can't find it, I'll just move on. I get it from the chair, actually. See if I can find it. Aha. Was able to find it. Let me turn the camera on here so y'all can see it. My computer will cooperate. There we are. Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind by Shunra Suzuki. So not to be confused with D.T. Suzuki. There he is on the back. As you can see, it's a very short book. It's just over, I mean, it's 137 pages. Very short book, but it's concise, and he really just, he understands that people get really intimidated, especially if people haven't meditated before. It really, he just says, don't worry about this idea of you're going to reach enlightenment, or the goal is to reach enlightenment, and what does that even mean? And are you just you're gonna meditate for X amount of months or years, and then it's gonna be like, oh, you're enlightened, and you know. His approach to Zen is every time you sit and meditate, you experience enlightenment. And this is something that was really picked up by people like Alan Watts, Fritz Perls, who pioneered Gestalt psychotherapy. He combined existentialism, Gestalt psychology, Eastern things like Zen, Taoism, etc., put them all together and actually formed a type of psychotherapy. And you know, it's just a really good book. And my experience with this is I read the book, and then I've meditated with Zen Buddhists myself, and it's difficult. It's a very difficult thing to do, but I've had a great experience doing it. Been exposed to Buddhism for a long time. My uncle and aunt are both Zen Buddhists, so this is something that's come up, you know, been a part of my life for a long time. But I just wanted to share that because, like I said, I thought, well, okay, in 1 week I've had more than one person say, hey, good book on Zen, on meditation. I was just, like three friends of mine asked about this subject, and I was like, I had an extra copy of this, gave it to one, suggested it to 2 others. So I'd like to suggest that all to you. It's really good. You know, meditation is something that is really good to do. And I say that as someone who doesn't meditate every day. I wish I did. It really helps with, and what I'm about to say is not meant to be, even though I'm in a counseling program, I'm not giving counseling advice here. I'm giving spiritual advice, if that's even better. But what I have found for myself personally is that meditation has been very helpful when it comes to dealing with anxiety and stress. And there's a lot of literature out there written by individuals who have shown that meditation of different types. It doesn't have to be Zen. It can be Hindu. It doesn't have to be even religious. It can just be very secular meditation. That's become a very big thing in wellness studies and psychotherapy, and different spiritual disciplines have adopted it. So just wanted to throw that out there. A couple other ideas that I've had going forward is a number of people have expressed interest in understanding more about Swedenborg. So Swedenborg is the dude who, I'll turn this off and turn it back on here. That's Swedenborg right there. People who have, and I do consider myself a Swedenborgian now, and people have asked me, well, how come you don't do any videos about Swedenborg? So I've wanted to change that. I've wanted to remedy that. And the way I want to do that is, you know, I've talked to people in my congregation who are interested in coming on the show to talk about Swedenborg and what's it like to be a Swedenborgian. I've had a few people who I think would be excellent guests. But what I like to do is something a little bit more consistent than that. So one thing I'd like to do, perhaps once a week, I was shooting for Sundays. So we'll see if that can work out. But what I like to do is do a short video series called like Swedenborg Sundays, where I take a piece of Swedenborg's writings, a sentence, paragraph, a whole page, no more than a page, and just read it and then try to break it down. And I was inspired to do this by a friend of mine who has just started reading Swedenborg for the first time. And he's going along, and he got to a certain point where he was like, okay, well, I followed Swedenborg up to this point, and then I got to this one point, and the dude just lost me. And I know at my church, we do a weekly study group where we're reading right now Swedenborg's book, Divine Love and Wisdom. Sometimes we meet for like an hour, you know, an hour a week, and we'll read a couple paragraphs of Swedenborg, and that, just those 2 paragraphs, spawns a whole hour discussion. So you can imagine we're like only on page like 24 of the book, of a book that's like 100-something pages, 200-something pages. And so I think my sense is that it would be beneficial if people were interested in that. Another idea I've had is that I also do some lay ministry. So in other words, I actually do the sermon at my church maybe once a month throughout the year. It rotates at my church. And I thought, I don't know if the congregation would be comfortable having the whole thing recorded, but I had this idea of maybe doing a live stream, a live broadcast of just me doing the sermon. And I don't know if anybody would be interested in that. I would love to get feedback on that. If people are like, no, that sounds really boring, then I won't do it. If some people are like, hey, yeah, that'd be interesting to see Ozzy CDA preaching for 20 minutes or something, then please, feedback would be appreciated. And if so, then that's another kind of video series, light video series. I mean, again, I only, do this like maybe once a month, so it wouldn't be wouldn't be every week, certainly. But the Swedenborg Sunday thing could be every week. And so I'm interested in potentially doing both of those things. I'll talk about the future guest idea as we get later into the show. But another thing that I wanted to announce, and I'm kind of sandwiching this in here, but I feel comfortable announcing this actually, is I've decided that I want to write my own spiritual memoir. So I've been reading Michael Muhammad Knight and his autobiographies for quite some time. And every time I read one of his books, I feel very inspired to write my own story. And so my own autobiography, if you will, of everything that's led up to this point. And I've decided that I'm going to actually do it. I'm going to write something. And so I feel comfortable announcing that I am going to plan on writing a memoir about my own spiritual journey. And so stay tuned. It's going to be a process for sure. And but I think it's exciting because a part of the book is obviously going to be about my early years starting off on YouTube and Stickam and the experiences I had doing videos and some of the people that I've tangoed with. And I think that that's going to be an interesting thing. I'm probably going to have to obviously change everyone's names and make it so that people aren't going to be like, hey, you wrote this about me. What the hell? So we'll see how that goes. But that's not going to be the whole focus of the book, but at least a chapter needs to be dedicated to that. Right? So something in the works. I haven't started it yet. I've got kind of like a first scene in my mind. I don't even know if I'm going to write it chronologically. It may just be kind of how my brain operates, which is like, oh yeah, and then that happened. Oh yeah, that happened, but I haven't really decided yet. It might be how I write it, and then I'll have a really good editor to put it straight. I'm really excited about that. I'm really excited because throughout the years, I've had great great feedback about my videos, which in some ways is like a journal. I've kept a journal consistently since 2010. So I have not everything, but I have a lot of really good moments that I, was able to pen down. That includes my own journey, but also my reflections on my interactions with other people. So I think the combination of my YouTube channel, those journals, my own recollections, etc., recollections of some of my really good friends who have known me for a long time, know me when I was doubting Catholicism and Christianity back in high school, when I converted to Islam in 2007, when I began to doubt Islam in 2011, ultimately leaving it, and now finding myself here. And that's like a very bam, 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 right? Those are the big points, but there's all that stuff in between that I think would make a really interesting narrative. So I'm definitely excited to get to the point where I feel like I want to do that. Another thing that I've been researching lately, and I just looked down, we got about 5 minutes. Oh, so it's 5:25 actually. So I think for right now, what I'm going to do, might hold off on the next thing that I was going to talk about. I was going to talk about J.R.R. Tolkien and religion, but I think I might hold off on that. So what I think I'm going to do is go on a break for a second here. Just a 5-minute break. And just a little break here, and I'm going to play some music, and I hope you all can hear it. Now, before people freak out, the music I'm going to play is actually my uncle. So I actually have permission to use this music. My uncle Terry J. Lowe. He's a musician. This is from his album Morning Star Blues. You can find it on Spotify. And I'm going to play one song from it, Morning Star, the title track. It's a 3-minute, 46-second song. I'm going to play that so I can get myself something to drink, and you all can have a break from hearing me talk. So I'm going to turn my camera off. Thank you for sticking with me. If you want to use this opportunity during the break, if someone wants to message me or leave a comment, let me know. If you want to call in, we're talking about a number of things. If you're just joining us, I'm going on a break for just about 4 minutes, and I will return. But right now, please listen. Hopefully you'll hear it through my crappy built-in speakers on my computer. This is Morning Star Blues from Terry J. Lowe. All rights reserved.
This is that old story. This is that old time. On the chance I see it, I'll turn this boat around. On a Saturday evening till the morning star. Oh, sweet honey, I'll find you all. Find you all. I'll find you all. I'll find you all. Came up sudden, got him on too soon. Heard her singing, heard her swoon. On a Saturday evening till morning star. Oh, sweet, I'll find you all. I'll find you all. I'll find you all. I'll find you all. It's no secret she's a sailor's dream. Love to see her hair float in the breeze. Lift the anchor, trim the sail, sailing to the trade winds fair. Trade winds fair. Trade winds fair. Trade winds fair. Had a load of money, now I got a load of bills. Oh, sweet honey, still give me the thrill. Should've learned my lesson quick this time. Now I'm standing on shaky ground. Shaky ground. Shaky ground. Shaky ground. Rock around told me, oh, you better hit the road. Made it still running, but now the girl is cold. Taking his advice, everything I own, trip the line, fantastic. Desolation road, desolation road, desolation road, desolation road. Just like commas, couldn't find common ground. Gonna attack this boat, turn this ship around. Channel is rocket, but the coast is clear. Gonna sail on the storm right out of here. Out of here. Right out of here. Right out of here. It's no secret she's a sailor's dream. Love to see her hair float in the breeze. Lift the anchor, trim the sail, sing to the trade winds fair. Trade winds fair. Trade winds fair. Trade winds fair. Channel is rocking, coast is clear, gonna sail on the storm right out of here. Right out of here. Right out of here. Right out of here.
All right. Welcome back, everyone. That was Terry J. Lowe and Morning Star Blues, all rights reserved. You can find Terry J. Lowe on Spotify. I have permission to play that song because Terry J. Lowe is my uncle. Excellent musician, if I do say so myself, but then again, I am biased for biological reasons. But no, I actually think it's good music, and I'm glad that I could actually use some tunes on the show. I had wanted to play some music during a break and thought, well, if I use pretty much any music, I'm either going to have to get the musician's permission or get sued. So I'm really glad that I have a loophole. I know a musician who has albums that are out and permission to use them. So I was going to talk about, before the break, I was going to talk about J.R.R. Tolkien religion. I think I'm going to save that for a different time. And what I'd like to do, because it is 5:32, so that we have just we're in the last half hour of the show. If anybody wants to call in, I'm checking my tabs here. Checking Twitter. Anybody? Nope. Checking YouTube. Nope. Checking Facebook. Nope. So no one wants to call in. That's all right. But we are going to switch gears for this within the last half hour. So what I'd like to do is hit Twitter and go through the news. I guess the biggest thing, the biggest Vatican elephant that's in the room, potentially, is Pope Francis. How could we not talk about Pope Francis in this program, considering everything that's been going on? Pope Francis is creating both good news, good vibes, and controversy among certain folks. There was so much tweeting happening about Pope Francis over the past couple days that when I was going to school, taking public transportation as I do, for my commute, I will go on Twitter and see, what is it that I've been missing out there in Twitter land. And needless to say, Pope Francis, Twitter was exploding Pope Francis articles. And even though I can't really find some of those articles, just scrolling down Twitter right now, it's just all Pope Francis stuff. The majority of it is Pope Francis. I can't go very many posts, but there's another Pope Francis. Oh, there he is again. There he is again. So what I'd like to do is just, talk about how amazing this is. So Pope Francis arrives, and he's walking his walk, and I think it's hilarious that there is controversy, right? Obviously, so maybe we should start with the controversy first, because everyone likes controversy, and I think it's really from the conservative reaction to the Pope. And this is an article that I saw because I follow them on Facebook, but MediaMatters.org. And this was one of the headlines that I saw that I think we'll start with this, and then we'll kind of backtrack. Because the Pope has done a lot of things, right? He did a prayer at the 9/11 memorial site. He was invited by some politicians when he was in Washington, D.C., to have lunch or whatever with them, and Pope Francis was like, I'm gonna go have lunch with a bunch of homeless people, because that's what Jesus would do. Okay, and it's just like, hell yeah, man, that is what Jesus would do. Jesus would go have lunch with some hookers, some homeless people, some drug addicts. Jesus, that's the crowd that Jesus would hang out with. The New Testament is like he was hanging out with lepers and the homeless, and healing the sick, and he was hanging out with prostitutes and tax collectors and undesirables, quote unquote, that society had deemed to be undesirables. His followers were a bunch of fishermen and people of hard labor. It's so I just admire Pope Francis for essentially being very Christ-like in this regard. But not everyone is happy. You know, and during his congressional, he's now he's now spoken at the UN National Assembly. He's talked at U.S. Congress, joint session of Congress, and the Pope is not shying away from speaking his mind about the fate of humanity in the world. But what's great about the way he's doing it is he's not like taking out a Bible and like bashing people over the head with it, right? He's not walking around going, "You all need to accept Jesus into your hearts," right? He's not doing that. He's meeting people where they're at. He understands he's talking to a multicultural, multi-religious, or non-religious, group of society, right? He's talking to a secular society. So I don't think I mean, he's the Pope, so we can't knock him for maybe talking about Jesus a few times or religion a few times, but he's done a great job of just speaking in terms of like, hey, we're messing up the environment. Maybe we should do something about that, right? Hey, global warming, by the way, maybe we should do something about that. He's being very reasonable here, in my opinion. But even though he's gone out of his way to say these amazing things, to do things that probably most conservative politicians would never do, like have lunch with homeless people, people still aren't satisfied with Pope Francis. Because, let's face it, there are people out there who just cannot stand it when you start talking about doing good to your neighbor, doing good to the environment. If you start sounding like a damn communist, that's when crap hits the fan for some people. So the Media Matters article, which I'm looking at here, is the headline reads, "Conservative Media versus the Pope. The worst reaction to Pope Francis' climate change encyclical." And the subtext is, Pope Francis' encyclical on climate change reveals his belief that there is a moral obligation to act swiftly on climate change, which disproportionately harms the world's poor. But conservative media are relentlessly attacking the Pope over the encyclical, calling it insipid and blasphemous, and fear-mongering that the Catholic leader is a Marxist, pushing for a new world order, among other things. So it says, Pope Francis has issued an encyclical on climate change that cites the scientific consensus that human activities are driving global warming and calls for reduced fossil fuel use in order to help the world's poor. I love it. This is the conservatives' worst nightmare. Help the world's poor and solve climate change at the same time. All we need now is to have Pope Francis bring out a gay man and a lesbian and hold hands with them and wash their feet, and this would cause the second coming, I'm sure, for many people. The article continues, based on a version of the encyclical that was leaked earlier in the week and closely matched the final version, Reuters reported that the encyclical shows that the Pope, quote, backs scientists who say global warming is mostly man-made and that developed countries have a particular responsibility to stem a trend that will hurt the poor the most, end quote. And it continues, the world could see the destruction of entire ecosystems. This is the Pope, I believe, talking. The world could see the destruction. This is the statement. Excuse me. The world could see the destruction of entire ecosystems this century without urgent action on climate change. Pope Francis says in a draft of his keenly awaited encyclical on the environment. In the Italian version of the 192-page document posted on Monday by the weekly magazine Espresso, the Pope again backs scientists who say global warming is mostly man-made, developed countries, etc., etc. By making environmental protection a moral imperative, Francis' intervention could spur the world's 1.2 billion Catholics to lobby policymakers on ecology issues. The Pope calls for reduction in carbon emissions and increase in policies that favor renewable energy and warns of the long-term effects of continuing to use fossil fuels as the main source of global energy, end quote. The New York Times reported on June 18th that the leaked version of the encyclical almost exactly matched the final document. USA Today noted, one of the highest forms of communication by the Pope is a letter to bishops, including to clarify, amplify, and condemn or promote an aspect of Catholic doctrine. Right. So this is pretty official. And now we get to the real juicy part: the right-wing media's attack on his statement and the Pope himself. And who is our all-star cast of people? None other. The first one on the list is Rush Limbaugh, who said that his proclamation, the encyclical, seems to confirm that Pope Francis is a Marxist. It says here, on June 16th edition of the Rush Limbaugh show, Limbaugh said that the encyclical seems to confirm that Pope Francis is a Marxist and suggests that the scientific studies cited in the encyclical are bought and paid for. Ha! He also called the encyclical the Pope's leaked Marxist climate rant on his website. Also, Limbaugh again says on his June 17th show, Limbaugh continued to criticize the Pope, claiming that he is aligning himself with those on the left who want to leave everybody living equally in misery. And that the encyclical suggests that rich countries need to keep giving money to the poor until our rich are no longer rich. Giving money to the poor. You know, I'm trying to think here. Who would have jived with that? You know, helping out the poor. Let me think. Think about that for you. Is there somebody historically and religiously that we can think of who would have? Let's think about this for. Oh, that's right, Jesus. Oh, right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Go figure. But you know, how dare the Pope? How dare the Pope say that the rich should give to the poor? How dare he? Okay. Michael Savage. Just keeps getting better and better. Conservative radio host Michael Savage declared on June 16th edition of his show, the Pope is a danger to the world. He continued by calling the Pope a great deceiver, stealth Marxist, an eco-wolf in Pope's clothing, and comparing him to the false prophet in the book of Revelation, directing mankind to worship the Antichrist. Wow. Savage concluded that we are living in a global tyranny right now. The Pope is a Marxist. I stand by these words. He is a wolf in Pope's clothing. He's an eco-wolf in Pope's clothing. He is a stealth Marxist in religious garb. He sounds like the false prophet in Revelation, directing mankind to worship the Antichrist. We're living in global tyranny right now. We're living in global tyranny where the big lie is told over and over again. What big lie? That we shouldn't decimate the world that we live in and that we should help the poor. I'm really confused as to why this is problematic. You know, why is this an issue? Why is it so controversial to say, you know, maybe we should care about our fellow man and the world that we live in, you know, the planet. Well, it mind boggles me that this is something that people can just be like, this is a Marxist thing. This is a liberal thing. And so therefore we should just ignore it. Amazing. It then says, WSJ columnist Peggy Noonan warned the Vatican might be making a mistake by trying to prevent another Galileo incident. In her column for the Wall Street Journal, Peggy Noonan posited that the Vatican is acting on climate change because it fears being tagged as anti-science and anti-fact, but that the church might be making a mistake by acting on unsettled science. Quote, also, the European elite is all in on climate change, and the Vatican is in Europe. The church fears being tagged as anti-science and anti-fact. But is the science of climate change settled? And can a church that made a mistake with Galileo 400 years ago make another mistake by trying desperately not to repeat the earlier one? Ha! Hilarious. It's like, well, we don't want, you know, the Vatican doesn't want to make another Galileo mistake. So it's going to back the consensus of scientists who study this phenomena, you know, and wow. Another Fox News, Greg Gutfeld called Pope Marxist. He says could be on Occupy Wall Street. On the June 16th edition of Fox News, the 5 co-hosts Greg Gutfeld brought up the Pope's supposed Marxist background and said the most dangerous person on the planet is someone who is seeking strange new respect from their adversaries, and that is what the Pope is doing. He wants to be a modern Pope. All he needs is dreadlocks and a dog with a bandana, and he could be on Occupy Wall Street. I would actually love to see that. I think that would be awesome if the Pope could get some dreadlocks going and get a dog and a bandana. I would actually pay money to see that. But see, the Pope doesn't need to do that. And I love how it says, oh, he's trying to be a modern Pope. A modern Pope? He's a Pope who's the Pope in the 21st century. How else should he be? You know, should he not be modern? Should he not be commenting on things that are modern issues? I mean, I'm sorry if these conservatives want to, dial back us to the 1950s when they can come home and say, "Oh, honey, is dinner ready?" And "Oh, the homosexuals don't have rights." And by God, we go to, there's prayer in school, and we're going to go to church every Sunday, and the Bible's the word of God. And if King James English was good enough for Jesus, it was good enough for me. Well, I'm sorry. You're living in a fantasy world. Okay. And I love that projection onto the Pope by saying, "Oh, he's trying to be a modern Pope." Yeah. Wake up and join the 21st century. We all should be modern. Really. Fox Business, Lou Dobbs. So on the June 16th edition of Fox Business, Lou Dobbs Tonight, host Lou Dobbs, said the climate change issue is ideological. Let me pause for a second. How ironic. And Fox News crapping on the global warming thing isn't ideological, right? But let's continue. Absolutely political, and not the stuff of which I would expect the Pope to be involved in. No, of course not. We wouldn't expect someone who cares about humanity to just be silent. No, of course not. Right. Dobbs went on to claim the Pope is talking about a new world order. He's talking about a new global organization. Right. Fox contributor. Do you notice a theme here? Who are the people? Limbaugh, Savage, Fox. I sense a pattern. Fox contributor Andrew Napolitano said, so he's a judge, frequent contributor to Fox News, criticizes the Pope on June 16th, interview on St. Louis-based radio station, claims the Pope wants to use the bully pulpit of the papacy to shame people into distributing wealth in such a manner so as to help the poor. And one of the ways he's trying to do that is by encouraging governments to get involved in restricting behavior that allegedly causes something allegedly called global warming. Again, I don't see what the problem is. What is the problem with warning about the destruction of our ecosystem, our global ecosystem, and of helping our fellow human beings? I still don't understand why that's a problem. And here we are again. Dobbs and the judge from before on June 17th said that Dobbs said the most troubling aspect of what the Pope is doing is talking about a new global authority to assure that his views are institutionalized. He's talking about some super government. Oh. And on and on and on we go. So we can see that the news media, the conservative news media to be specific, is freaking out. It's freaking out over the Pope. I think it's great. I always love this when someone like this just sets these people off. I really do. And I think it's because it's the Pope that it just makes it that much entertaining. So I think the Pope is right on with what he's saying, and I can confess my biases. Being a liberal, I can confess that, but I just think that it's just hilarious that the big gripe that people have is he cares about the poor. He cares about the poor. How dare he care about the poor? And it's just like, yeah, he cares about the poor. He's the Pope. He's the spokesperson for the Catholic Church. He's the vicar of Christ on earth. Emphasis on Christ. Amazing. Scrolling on down, I'm still seeing stuff about the Pope. Go figure. The New York Times at NY Times 2 hours ago on Twitter tweeted an article: when the Pope saw a boy with cerebral palsy waiting to see him, he stopped his car. So again, the Pope is, and there's a really nice picture of the Pope embracing this boy with cerebral palsy. The Pope is just, he's doing his thing, man. I mean, he is not, he's not messing around. CNN reported, at CNN, I report, a local Philadelphia barber has been offering Pope Francis-inspired hairdos, and there is a picture of that. Very interesting. So again, everyone is just, I mean, I've had friends of mine who are agnostic, who have said, if Pope Francis had been the Pope when I was younger, I would have considered converting to Catholicism. I mean, he is inspiring people left and right. from various perspectives, and rightfully so. Continuing on down, just trying to see if there's anything else of that has nothing to do with Pope Francis. I forgot to mention that Pope Francis, of course, offered prayers of he grieved with the 700 plus individuals that were trampled to death, that died during the Hajj pilgrimage ritual. There's another thing as well. And again, it's all pretty much about Pope Francis. Literally, I am hard pressed to find something. Again, New York Times. Pope Francis blessed a child while greeting the crowd at Independence Hall in Philadelphia. It's just constant Pope Francis stuff. If you're tired of hearing about it, I apologize. There's nothing I can do about it. This is what the news media wants to. Oh, well, okay, this is kind of funny. Again about Pope Francis, but The Onion, at The Onion. Again, this is not real news, people. Pope Francis reverses position on capitalism after seeing a wide variety of American Oreos. There's a picture, photoshopped, I would imagine, of Francis holding 2 types of Oreos. Well, I guess that would change someone's opinion about American capitalism, to see different types of Oreos. Some people have said that, oh, no, that's something else. Well, going on down here, I am still not seeing anything here. John Boehner resignation sparks secession fight. The only reason why I would mention that in any context is because, you know, Boehner apparently was very moved by Pope Francis. People are hypothesizing that maybe that's why he's leaving. But who can say? Or stuff about the Pope, because, you know, go figure, the Pope. More again about the Pope. Oh, here we go. U.S. Russia may be seeking proxy in case Syria's al-Assad falls. We'll click on that. This is CNN Politics 8 hours ago. Tweeted this particular article. Let's. I can actually get into it here. Anything that has to do with the present crisis in the Middle East, we should probably highlight that. I realize I don't have very much time. Again, if anybody would like to call in within the last 8 minutes we have left in the show, would like to say something. I'd be curious to pose a question just to everybody in general. What are people's feelings about Pope Francis? Regardless of the media, right? Well, I guess we have to kind of go with the media because how else are you going to learn about what Pope Francis is doing and saying? I'd be really curious to, you know, hear what are people's thoughts about Pope Francis, outside of just, you know, these big named individuals who are, you know, freaking out. So apparently Russia, U.S. intelligence community now thinks Russia may have embarked on a military buildup in Syria because Moscow believes Syrian President Bashar al-Assad may not be able to hang on to power and wants to position itself to back a proxy if the regime were to collapse. This is a view shared by the Pentagon, defense officials told CNN. This is one theory, but there is not a firm conclusion within the Obama administration about why Russian President Vladimir Putin is sending aircraft, tanks, and missiles into the war-torn country, several senior U.S. officials told CNN. So the proxy war continues. Well, I think that's all for the news for today. What I'd like to do within the last 5 minutes, we may end the show a little early today, but I do want to quickly go over ideas for the future episodes. So looking at my agenda here, next Saturday, next episode will be October 3rd, and I will have my friend who is an atheist. I'm going to have him on the show. We're going to talk about spirituality and religion. And so he's agreed to come on. So he's going to come. He'll be my special guest next episode. I also have plans to have the Swedenborgian friend of mine come on, discuss what it's like to be an ex-Mormon turned Swedenborgian. That may be the Saturday after that. I'm still hoping to have Klingshore on the show. Wayman29 is still looking around to find the panelists that I talked about last episode. To have a Jew, a Christian, and a Muslim on a three-way panelist to talk about what happens when history and archaeology contradicts held religious beliefs. What do people do? Do they drop kick their beliefs? Do they modify it? And what experiences they have in that regard? So a lot of fun stuff coming down the pike. But for next week, October 3rd, that next episode will be my special guest will be my friend who is an atheist to talk about spirituality and religion. And he and I will be discussing that together. So thank you all for watching. I think we'll end the show here. I know there's 4 minutes left to spare, but thank you for joining me again. Thank you for listening. If you're going to be listening to this as an archived video, and if you have any questions between now and then, comments are welcome to be posted in the comment section of the archived video. If you have any suggestions for any topics you'd like me to cover in future episodes, I'm open to any suggestions, or anybody you'd like to would like to see on the show. That'd be great as well. Ideas are most welcome. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next Saturday on the 10th episode of Dreaming in Symbols. Peace be with you all.